So, I'm actually quite a big fan of the iconic cartoon duo known as Tom and Jerry. And how can you not know who these guys are? I mean, these are two of the most iconic cartoon characters of all time. They have been a part of our culture for so long and been a part of so many great animated shorts, it's hard not to ignore their impact on pop culture. So when I found out that there was a Tom and Jerry movie coming to HBO Max, I was certainly going to be interested in watching it. And I figured, hey, since there's a lot I had to say about both the characters of Tom and Jerry and the movie itself, I figured it would be a good opportunity to maybe review and take a deep dive at this Tom and Jerry movie. So let's get started. Let's go right into talking about the Tom and Jerry movie I watched on HBO Max.
And this time, I mean it.
And boy, it was not that much better than the movie from back in the 90s. Now, I'm going to be the first to admit that I was a little bit interested in this movie. Granted, I still had some doubts for a lot of things, but like most people, I want any movie that's associated with something I like turn out to be good. Unfortunately, Tom and Jerry 2021 is one of the laziest and most uninteresting films I have seen in quite some time. Though I will start with some minor praises for this movie, starting with the element that made me a little bit more interested in this movie than I originally would have been. And that is that the 2D animation integrated here is at least interesting. Rather than making Tom and Jerry look like weird, grotesque CGI characters with more realism, they made the right choice by making Tom and Jerry and every other character in this movie look like a cartoon character for a change. The models are still 3D, but they do a good job at making these characters as expressive and colorful as we expected. The best parts of this movie are the ones where Tom and Jerry are actually chasing each other, and because of the animation style, it's pretty amusing to see witness, especially as a neat little experiment in regard to utilizing 2D animation in film. And that's about it really in regards to things that had actual effort put into it. Because man, this is one slog of a movie that's barely creative or even that enjoyable. Sure, this movie might seem better than the 90s movie on a surface level, with the movie having an interesting animation technique, the movie having more pre-existing Tom and Jerry characters this time around, and the fact that Tom and Jerry are still more like how we usually expect them, as in being a silent duo. But despite that, it doesn't change the fact that this movie honestly feels a lot more effortless in terms of taking advantage of the Tom and Jerry franchise. Right off with the animation. While it is an element that's the most interesting to see unfold here, the movie itself doesn't justify itself being an animation live-action hybrid movie. Mainly because when you look at this movie from a filmmaking perspective, it's honestly the most standard and basic form of filmmaking you can find in any movie of this caliber. Majority of the scenes in this movie are shown in standard shot reverse shot, with it looking oddly cheap with a lot of shots looking flat, and it almost looks like a direct to streaming or TV movie. Even though this movie was released in theaters, even with the animation style, this movie doesn't take advantage of it because the filmmaking is really no different than what we've seen in other bad kids movies like this or the Smurfs. It's almost like these characters are only 2D animated as a way to get a pass from animation nerds who want 2D animation to strive. Well, as someone who is an animation nerd and wants more 2D animation, it doesn't work here, because the rest of this movie is just boring, pandering kids movie garbage that overshadows any talent shown by these artists. The majority of this movie is dull scenes of human characters talking about this wedding, and it's totally something kids want to see in a Tom and Jerry movie, right?
You're one of those millennials that thinks they can get whatever they want, whenever they want, without working for it. Preferably with free shipping.
Who doesn't like?
When are they gonna get to the fireworks factory?
This little cat plan works. Because if it
The best argument with doing this movie differently is that they should have made this 100% animated in this 2D, 3D style, which I can definitely understand, since even in the context of this movie, there's not much of an explanation to why this world exists. It's just a world where all the animals are 2D cartoon characters for some reason. Doesn't really do a good job at world building compared to other movies, and instead just feels feels like it's done for the sake of it. If this movie was fully animated, I could definitely see it being better in that regard. However, if they did wanted to make it a hybrid movie with live action, there are two ways I can honestly see this being done better. Either make this movie exist in this kind of hyper stylized world where everything reacts like a cartoon in the same vein of something like Scott Pilgrim, and that way you can also actually have some creativity with the cinematography and editing, making this film be a live action cartoon in a sense. Or they could have gone with a more self-aware parody vibe, kind of like a Muppet movie where it's Tom and Jerry essentially crashing a movie of a different genre, where they make fun of the tropes and character archetypes that are seen, but they do neither of that here. And you would think they would try the more self-aware route, at least, considering how popular films like the Lego Movie and Deadpool did with its meta humor. Instead, this movie plays it straight with its human characters, and it's painfully dull with weird, awkward humor that doesn't fit with Tom and Jerry, and it is horribly unfunny on its own too. This movie may not be 2 hours, but feels longer because it loves to waste its time with boring SX filler. When Tom and Jerry are not on screen, this movie drags immensely, with this movie's original characters also being bland and honestly kind of unlikable. I mean, for as much as I like Chloe Grace Moretz, her character here is kind of bad, with her doing some very discouraging stuff early on, and not really that much to her outside of her being the main human element to latch onto. She would be better to latch onto if she wasn't a generic archetype we've seen in so many other movies of this caliber before. Plus her doing things like discouraging another employee to leave a job just so she can get the job on her own doesn't really make her that much better, honestly. And there's also Michael Pena, who plays a relatively bad guy character who's made to look evil for, like, no reason, and also has some very basic and very cringe jokes too. The worst part is that they somehow made the original characters that were used in the 90s movies better. For all the cliches and archetypes they were, at least some of them were so wacky and odd that they were hard not to look away. I mean, I'll take Squawk and Rip Taylor's weird dynamic and Applejack's scary Harvey Weinstein face over Pena's rather generic main antagonist. And if these characters weren't bad enough, the film's soundtrack is honestly hot garbage. Every single song is a really terrible pop song that's made to be trendy and cool, with a score that's no different than the cheapest typical comedy score that feels overly modernized. Come on, even the 90s movie had a few bops with songs like the Alley Cat song, despite that one even being unnecessary. And the worst part about this whole soundtrack, though, is not once did they use the original Tom and Jerry theme music. Seriously? Not even for like the credits or title sequence? Come on, it's 2021. Stop neglecting to add the theme music to an iconic property when you totally could and should. So overall, yeah, Tom and Jerry 2021 is a massive disappointment of a movie that could have been something. But Warner Brothers just decided to do the trendy route. I thought we were past the live action Chipmunks and Smurfs style of movie. The fact that this movie manages to not improve on those kind of movies, and even the original 90s movie, makes it so much worse. It's not Disney remake levels of awful, but it is a waste of time with no real care for its characters. It's sad that even the 2D animation can't even save this movie, but unfortunately, maybe Tom and Jerry is just one of those things that needs to stick with being to shorts. Because between this and all the other movies, they have not gotten a proper treatment in feature films. Maybe someday we'll get a good Tom and Jerry movie, but for now, this is not a good substitute for that. I guess we can look on the bright side. We now have 2 Tom and Jerry movies that are on the same level of quality, more or less. Who am I kidding? That's not an accomplishment. I'm gonna give Tom and Jerry 2021 a 2 out of 10.
Man, I want my money back.
What the heck do we care? What do we care?